Hi, and welcome to Master of Horror, where I bring you the most scariest stories that I've ever come by. I would like to apologize for not posting last week. I have been in the process of moving, and now I will be back on schedule. Please help me get to 1,000 subscribers, and give this video a thumbs up. So now, my friends, please dive with me into the depths of horror with these scary, true, paranormal, and horror stories with Thunderstorm sounds. True paranormal story number 1. My paranormal experiences. It is very likely that something is haunting our house. Through the years, I've experienced quite a few supernatural things in the house, like hearing footsteps when no one is around. The footsteps come from areas that are no longer walkable, like walking through closet walls and windows. Things and objects are thrown from shelves, but they don't just fall. They'll be lifted several inches into the air, hang there for a moment, and then get thrown to the ground with great force. And we always try to find a logical explanation. But after a while, we try to ignore these paranormal experiences or find a rational explanation. One experience involves my younger brother and sister. When my brother was a toddler, he woke up one morning and told the whole family that during the night, he got out of bed and went downstairs. When he got there, an old lady yelled at him to get back to bed. My younger sister had the same experience a few years later. They were both about 2 or 3 years old when it happened. So my sister hadn't even been born when it happened to my older brother. But the time it happened to her, my brother had completely forgotten that it happened to him. So it is very unlikely that he told her about it. Over the years, my parents and I have tried to explain it away, telling ourselves that they were only dreaming, but the fact that they both described the lady in nearly identical terms does prove that they just might be telling the truth. They claim they saw this old lady in the newest part of the house too. You see, we added a new section to the house that we built back in 2007. I've never felt comfortable in that part of the house, despite it being the most newest. All that was on the land before we built the addition was a single tree and some grass, but I feel very uncomfortable there. For a couple of years, the activity actually stopped, but it started up again recently. Recently, I've had books thrown around in my bedroom, and my mother woke up a few days ago when she thought that she heard my sister coming down the hallway. You see, my sister always asks my mom to do her hair in the morning, despite being old enough to do it herself. That particular morning, my mom didn't want to do my sister's hair, so she pretended to still be asleep. After a little while, she heard a voice next to her calling, "Mom, Mom, Mommy," whispering, thinking it was my sister. About 30 seconds passed, and my sister hadn't tried to shake my mom awake or sit on the bed as she normally does in the morning. My mom decided to open her eyes, only to find that she was completely alone in the room, and my sister was still in her own bed asleep. My parents' bedroom was located directly above the room where my brother and sister saw that old lady. So now we've had an old entity and a child entity that may be connected to the land or the original house. Having lived in this house as long as we have, we're not entirely bothered by most of the things that have happened, and nothing ever really harmed us. As for the voice calling out to my mom and addressing her as Mommy, well, that did spook us a lot, because it's the most concrete thing that's happened to us, and it's the hardest to explain away. Paranormal True Story Number 2, The Ghost Bride. This happened in late March in India. I was 14 years old. This happened in my village. There was no cinema, so I had to travel about 12 kilometers to get to the nearest theater. We usually went to the movies in groups, but one day none of my friends wanted to go, so I headed out alone for the evening show. Afterwards, I was dropped off at a bus stop that's located at the edge of my village. It was around 11 p.m., and my village being very small, I was all alone with no one around. I started walking towards home along the main road. After walking for about 20 minutes, I saw a woman. She was dressed in white and red. I felt really scared and I knew she couldn't be human. She was covering her face with the garment, just like newlyweds do in India. So I assumed she was a new bride. I thought to myself, what's a newlywed bride doing out here, all alone, late at night? She was just standing there with only trees surrounding her. I called down to where she was and asked if she needed help, but instead of answering, she started walking into the trees, and I found myself following her all the way. But no matter how fast I walked, I was never able to catch up to her. She was always ahead of me. After a while, I regained consciousness. I looked around and discovered that I had wandered into the middle of a jungle. Suddenly, all the scary stories that my elders ever told me came back to my memory, and I stood there frozen in fear. I remember that in our culture, an evil spirit will appear dressed as a newlywed bride with no legs. Slowly, I looked down at the woman's legs and realized she didn't have any at all. I wanted to run, but the thought of her being behind me and possibly chasing me down made me feel sick and nauseous. I had chills and goosebumps all over my body. Just as all of this was coming through my mind, she stopped and turned to look at me. At that very moment, I told myself, you better run or you're gonna die right here. So I ran, and when I got close to my home, I started screaming for my mother. I then felt something grab my shoulder. It felt like a claw-like heavy hand. I screamed one last scream that I was barely able to do. My mother and brothers came outside and asked me what was wrong. I explained everything to them. They looked at my back because I said it was hurting, and there they saw claw-like scratch marks. My mother performed some rituals before letting me into the house. She wanted to ward off evil spirits so that it would never enter our home. I suffered from a very high fever for 3 days straight after seeing that evil bride. Once I was healthy again, I asked my mom if there were any new brides in our village or any surrounding village, and she said no, there was not. I still went to the movies after that, but only during the day, and never, ever alone at night again. Paranormal True Story Number 3, Bloody Mary. When I was 12 years old, I became very interested in the paranormal. So my friend told me about standing in front of a mirror and reciting the words Bloody Mary several times in a row. Supposedly, this Bloody Mary would show up in person if you do that. I wanted to try it, but I was too afraid to do it alone. So one day, this friend and I stayed after school. After everyone had left, we walked down through the empty hall in the girls' bathroom in front of the mirror and began saying Bloody Mary 5 times in a row. We then heard a very strange female voice calling our names. We were terrified. and we ran out into the hallway, but nobody was around. 2 days later, I was sleeping in my upstairs bedroom, and I was awoken around 2 in the morning by the sound of crying. My parents were downstairs in their bedroom asleep, and there were no TVs or radios on at the time. I was terribly frightened because it sounded like a young woman crying right there next to me in my room. Then, I will never forget what happened next. I looked up and I saw a lady standing next to my bed weeping. She was very pale and had tears coming down her face. Her head was surrounded by massive unruly black hair. She wore a torn white dress. Continuing to cry, she just stared at me. I finally said, "Leave me alone." Then she disappeared, but I could not sleep again that night. The next night, I dreamt that the spirit of another woman was choking me, and the crying lady from the previous night was standing right next to her watching. I then woke up and I couldn't breathe. It felt like somebody was in the room with me. I ran out of my room in the pitch black hallway and screamed. My parents came rushing upstairs. I feel that by chanting Bloody Mary, I somehow drew these spirits to me, and it was a very, very scary experience. Although I didn't like what happened to me, I still do want to explore the paranormal. However, I'm afraid of what might happen, and my parents think I'll go to hell if I continue. We invited something evil. This story happened to me when I was still a teenager. I had a wonderful boyfriend at the time. He had experienced numerous paranormal encounters, yet for some odd reason he insisted on trying to explain everything with reason and logic. According to him, there was no spirits, demons, or even God. It was very annoying because his whole life was full of paranormal experiences. Yet somehow he chose not to believe in the paranormal. He would argue endlessly to prove he was right. One day, we were in his room and we had gotten into a discussion about the paranormal. I decided to tell him an old story I had heard, a story that had no loopholes for him to use against me. I will not narrate the story, mainly because the horror we experienced that day seems to be linked to the story. The most I would say is that it is a story about an ancient evil spirit which attacked several different people, and a lot of other pieces of evidence were presented in the story. I thought the fact that there were several witnesses to these events, my boyfriend could not argue against it. However, he still argued, and while we were arguing, I noticed there was a slight change in the atmosphere. The change was subtle, but I'm quite sensitive, so I noticed. I just ignored the feeling and kept arguing with my boyfriend, but the feeling intensified. It was like an evil pressure that kept increasing at some point. It felt like we were not alone in the room anymore. At that point, I was having difficulty following the argument because I couldn't coherently arrange my ideas. Then suddenly, my boyfriend stopped talking. His face became really pale, and he said in a really frightened voice, "Do you feel that?" I said yes. We decided to leave the room and go outside for some fresh air, hoping to escape the evil atmosphere. My two sisters were downstairs. We walked past them, telling them we were going for a walk, but they kept looking at us bizarrely, and oddly enough, they seemed distant. Like they were not really there, like they were on another side, like a mirror. My boyfriend and I went outside, but that evil atmosphere followed us. I was really worried, not just about the evil atmosphere that was following us, but also because we seemed detached from our surroundings. The trees, houses, people, the street, and even the cars driving by. Everything seemed like it was in a different dimension. I turned to ask my boyfriend if he was experiencing the same thing too, but noticed he couldn't hear me. I called out to him, but he did not respond. So I reached out my hand to touch him, just so I can get his attention. But he started running so fast and so scared, like something was chasing him. I tried to call out to him, but no matter how much I shouted, he couldn't hear me. And it seemed that none of the passerbyers could hear me either, although some of them kept looking at me bizarrely. To my horror, my boyfriend ran into the street and was knocked down by a car. I screamed and shouted and ran to him. He was unconscious. Other passerbyers also gathered, and together we called emergency services. He was rushed to the hospital and thankfully he recovered. He later told me that he started running because he could see a dark, very scary entity chasing him, and all that he could see around him was darkness. Also, I later realized that when the car ran him over, I rushed to him, and that's when I felt the evil atmosphere disappear. And that feeling of being cut off from this reality was also gone. It's been many years since we had that experience, and we are no longer together, but we're still close friends, and every once in a while we talk about those events. What we've concluded, based on our understanding of those events, is that while arguing about the paranormal story, I told my then boyfriend we somehow invited an evil spirit, probably the evil spirit of the story, and that was possible maybe because of how much emotion we were putting into the argument. Please beware of the supernatural. It's real. He now believes, but as for me, I always have. The Goat Girl. While I was driving down the highway one night, headed home from working late at my job, I came across a young woman standing on the side of the road. I pulled up to her and asked her if she needed a ride, and she then nodded her head up and down and smiled at me. I opened my truck door and she hopped in. As we began driving down the road, I asked her where she was headed, and she told me to just go to the nearest town, which was about 20 minutes away. This girl looked young, maybe around 18 years old, and she did not talk the whole time. I decided to play some music, so I put my tape in the cassette player. After about 3 minutes of listening to music, I reached over to turn off the cassette player, but I accidentally hit the eject button, and the cassette tape fell onto the ground of the truck. She looked down at the cassette on the ground, and so did I, but I was driving at the same time. So, as I held on to the wheel with one hand, my other hand reached down to the ground to pick up the cassette. I was looking at the road, and every once in a while I had to look back down to the floor to grab the tape. The cassette tape was right next to her feet. As I looked at her feet, I was shocked to the core. What I saw to this day has petrified me. What I'm about to tell you is something that only the brave can handle. This girl had goat legs and goat feet. Her legs had fur and her feet were hooves. I was in shock and my eyes opened wide and I could feel my face go numb. I quickly looked at her and she was staring right at me. She knew that I saw her legs. I sat back up really quickly, and through the corner of my eye, I could see she was still staring at me. I couldn't stop shaking. She then started laughing. I can hear her laughing and giggling, yet through the corner of my eye, her mouth wasn't even moving. I slammed on the brakes and reached over quickly, grabbed the handle to the truck, and I opened the truck door. I lifted up my leg and I kicked her out. She flew out of the truck. I then slammed on the gas and took off. I was driving the truck well over 100 miles an hour down the highway. I looked over to my left out of the window, and her face was looking right at me. She was flying and gliding right next to my truck window. How was this even possible, I thought. She was cursing and yelling. I could hear her screaming through the window. I drove even faster, and I don't know how fast I was going. but it must have been fast because she vanished. I made it to the nearest town. I got off, had to get my composure together. I was traumatized, and to this very day, I still am.